Today, I want to talk about illness. It's a really heavy subject, but it's something that most of us at some point are all going to face, whether it's something that we have to deal with ourselves or with a loved one. I found out that 2 months ago, my mother has stage 4 cancer, melanoma, and so I really thought this would be an opportune time to tell you about my personal experience and how having a spiritual practice has really been the rock that has saved me. But before I begin, if at any point you find that this video is helpful, then please like and subscribe so this information can reach more people who might also benefit from watching. Dealing with grief. Grief is very multi-layered, multifaceted. And I find that the more I allow the grief that's inside of me to come up and release, the better that I feel. Because otherwise, it feels like a pressure cooker that wants to explode. During the time that I spent grieving over the loss of any normalcy that I might continue to have with my mother, or the thoughts around her having a longer life, all of these thoughts, all of these memories and feelings of loss really started to bubble up inside of me. And luckily, I have a lot of people around me that are supportive and loving, and I was able to release a lot of these emotions. But once I got over that initial process of crying and releasing, I began to notice that every single time, without fail, every time I would start to feel an emotion, specifically grief, it was because of something that I was thinking. Always, without fail. I began to notice that my thoughts were like a river. It was so intense. This grief would come up from deep inside of me and it would just pour out of me. All of these thoughts, there were so many and it was so rapid that it was hard to not just fly down that river of pain. And the more and more I began to watch all of my thoughts, the more that river would slow and the more distance I would get from it. And then something very interesting happened. I remember even just a few nights ago, I was lying down on the couch and I started to notice all of my thoughts. And I didn't get to the point where I started to feel anything because I was just watching all of my thoughts. And it was incredible. They came from behind my head and this energy came up over me and it flowed down all the way into my solar plexus area. And as I watched this energy come up and over me, I had this incredible choice at that moment. And the choice was to decide whether I wanted to dive into those thoughts and go down into the depths of despair and be pulled into those dark places, or I had the option to not go down into those deep, dark depths of despair. And in that moment, I decided, you know what? I really don't want to do this. And what happened is that energy that was over me, it immediately, instantly went like this. And it came back up over my head. And, and I stayed up here. My consciousness, my awareness didn't sink. It didn't fall. And I didn't end up feeling any of those emotions. It was incredible. And I realized that it is always, without fail, my thoughts. My thoughts are what drag me down that river. And it's beautiful when you have that choice, when you have that moment where you can decide that you don't need to do that. Deciding to stay present. Now, the really interesting part about this whole process with my mom is that every single day, and sometimes every single moment, was different. And by that I mean she would feel different, every day would present a new challenge, or some days she would just, for whatever reason, feel better, and those days were great. But when I would get hit with something that wasn't pleasant, and that was harder to stomach and harder to stay open to, I would realize that the key was for me to just be here now. Because otherwise I would get dragged with my thinking again, and I would get pulled into a potential future that was a really negative one. And so the thing that really helped me was staying present, and staying present just moment by moment by moment. Nothing is inherently good or bad. What is liberation? When you think about freedom, I realized that freedom comes when you're okay with what is. when you are able to get to a place of acceptance with something that feels unbearable. And that is freedom. It's being okay. It's accepting what is. And by that, I mean the good and the seemingly bad. The other thing I realized during this experience with my mom is that maybe, just maybe, nothing is really bad. Maybe everything is just beautiful as it is. Maybe I don't understand why certain things are happening and why things that might seem bad are really just an opportunity for me to be able to see the divinity in everything. Something very interesting did happen to me. It didn't last, but for several days, I was able to see the divinity in everything. I was able to see how everything that's happening, even my mother having cancer, was this beautiful act of God, that there's grace in everything, that it's everywhere, that it's inescapable. And being able to see the world in that way was such a gift that I never would have had this not happened. The best life insurance you could ever have. Having a spiritual practice is so important. I know I've said this so many times, but I can't tell you enough how important it is when you're dealing with something like illness. Sometimes when we're meditating or when we're doing all of these practices that feel so intangible, it's very difficult sometimes to see our own growth and to be able to have a metric that can measure how far we've come. But I promise you, nothing is going to show you how much you've grown than when you go through an experience like your mother dealing with cancer or the loss of a loved one. And when you have a spiritual practice, you are going to be able to handle all of those hard times with such an incredible amount of grace. And that is how you know that you've grown. And that is how you know that having a spiritual practice is the most important thing. Because that is what is going to allow you to deal with all of it. Life, freedom, liberation is about dealing with all of it, is about being able to stay open during the toughest of times. And if you do not commit to growing your awareness and this sense that you are consciousness, then when something like the death of a loved one or illness, when those things hit, you are never going to be able to have enough awareness to see that you can pull out of it. It's going to be very difficult to have the mental fortitude, to have the witness consciousness, to be able to have enough awareness around catching your thoughts, to be able to focus on the now and the moment that's right in front of you. All of those things become very difficult when you haven't practiced them prior. So now is the time to start practicing these things so that when something does hit that's going to be harder to deal with, you are very well prepared. I love you all so much. Until next time, remember to let go. Let go of trying to be anything other than the truth of what you are.